Imagine the most spectacular, awe-inspiring structure ever erected on the face of the earth. We're talking about a complex built with massive, perfectly hewn stones.
Some of those weighing hundreds of tons, yeah.
Exactly. Hundreds of tons. You've got courtyards upon courtyards, towering colonnades, intricate carvings of palm trees, open flowers, and an inner sanctuary completely overlaid with blinding pure gold.
And guarded by those fierce angelic sentinels woven right into the tapestries.
Right, the cherubim. It's a place of absolute, unapproachable holiness. A place where the infinite intersecting with the finite is mediated through thick smoke, incense, and strict lethal boundaries.
Lethal being the key word there.
Yeah. Now, I want you to imagine a theology, a grand overarching narrative of the cosmos that insists the ultimate final goal of all creation is to actually tear that magnificent building down.
It's a phenomenal paradox. I mean, we spend so much time in our historical and theological studies looking at the meticulous construction of these ancient sacred spaces, right? We analyze the blueprints, the materials, the socio-political capital required to build them.
Oh, absolutely.
And yet, the climax of the biblical story is essentially an empty space where a building used to be. The ultimate architectural triumph is the absence of architecture.
Welcome to the deep dive. We have a phenomenal stack of sources on the table today, and we are getting into some incredibly dense scholarly analyses of what theologians refer to as the temple motif.
Drawing heavily from comprehensive papers like A History of God's Presence with His People and analysis of the temple passages.
Yeah, these sources trace a single, unbroken architectural and theological thread from the opening pages of Genesis all the way to the closing chapters of Revelation. But the mission for this deep dive goes beyond just, an academic survey of Middle Eastern building projects.
Yeah, we're not just looking at floor plans today.
No, not at all. The focus today, and the question we want you to carry through this entire discussion, is deeply personal. How can understanding this grand, sweeping theology of God's presence actually deepen your love for Jesus?
That's the core of it.
How can seeing this architectural progression completely reframe what devout living looks like for you today? Because we are tracing the most profound love story ever told, God's relentless, unyielding pursuit to dwell with humanity.
To truly grasp the end of that story, that paradoxical image of a renewed world entirely devoid of a temple structure, we really have to start at the absolute beginning.
The garden.
Yes. We have to look at what scholars in comparative religion and biblical theology call the axis mundi.
Center of the world.
Exactly. The precise coordinate where the transcendent, invisible realm of the creator perfectly intersects with the immanent, material realm of the creature.
And what's fascinating in the literature is how conservative evangelical biblical theology consistently identifies the very first axis mundi. Because the first temple wasn't a building of stone or cedar.
It was a botanical environment.
Yeah. The Garden of Eden in Genesis 2 and 3 is presented as the primordial archetype upon which all subsequent temples, tabernacles, and visionary sanctuaries are intricately patterned.
The sources delve quite deeply into the structural and lexical proofs for this. If you look at the ancient Near Eastern context, temples were generally conceived as the gardens of the gods. But Genesis elevates and refines this concept significantly.
So structurally, how does that map out?
Well, the Garden of Eden exhibits a very specific tripartite gradation of holiness. You have the outer world, the uncultivated, ordinary space.
The wild.
Right. Then you have the garden itself, which is a zone of special access and order. And finally, at the very center, you have the inner divine presence zone, where the tree of life stands and where the presence of God is most localized.
And that tripartite structure, outer court, holy place, and most holy place, that becomes the exact immutable blueprint for the wilderness tabernacle, for Solomon's massive permanent temple, and even for Ezekiel's visionary complex during the exile.
The architectural DNA of the temple is literally present in the soil of Genesis 2.
That is so cool. And the parallels the sources draw don't stop at just the three-tiered layout. The orientation of the garden is highly specific. Genesis 3.24 notes that the entrance to Eden faces east.
Which is a critical detail. When the Israelites eventually construct the tabernacle in the Sinai wilderness, the entrance faces east. When Solomon builds his permanent temple on Mount Moriah, oriented precisely to the east...
Even Ezekiel's visionary temple.
Faces east, yeah. But perhaps the most striking structural parallel involves the personnel guarding that eastern entrance. After the expulsion of humanity, Genesis tells us that the eastern gate of Eden is guarded by the cherubim, equipped with a flaming sword.
The cherubim. It is fascinating to trace their function throughout the rest of the biblical text,
Yeah.
because wherever these angelic beings appear, they are invariably and exclusively associated with guarding sacred space and the divine presence. When you look at the instructions for the tabernacle, cherubim are embroidered directly into the veil that separates the holy place from the Holy of Holies. Later, in Solomon's temple, massive cherubim carved from olive wood and overlaid with gold are constructed to overshadow the Ark of the Covenant itself.
They are the perennial sentinels of the Axis Mundi. And furthermore, the Genesis account goes out of its way to mention that the region of Havilah, which is connected to Eden's river system, possesses high-quality gold and onyx.
It seems like a random detail until you look at the Exodus blueprints.
Exactly. The sources immediately flag this, because gold and onyx are the exact precious materials later prioritized in the construction of the tabernacle, and specifically, the garments of the high priest.
So the physical environment of Eden is heavily laden with temple iconography. But the lexical analysis provided in our stack is where the argument becomes just undeniable. It radically redefines our understanding of what the first humans were actually doing in that space.
Because if Eden is the proto-temple, it naturally follows that Adam is not merely an agricultural worker.
He's not just a gardener.
No, he is functioning as the archetypal priest.
Yes, the systemic functional linguistics analysis in our sources regarding Genesis 2.15 is incredibly illuminating here. The English translation typically says God placed Adam in the garden to work it and keep it.
Work and keep.
But the Hebrew verbs utilized there are abad and shamar.
Those two specific verbs form a crucial semantic pair. Abad carries the meaning of to serve, to work, or to worship. Shamar means to guard, to keep, or to observe.
In the immediate context of agriculture, you could translate them as farming and protecting.
You could. However, when you trace the specific verbal combination through the rest of the Pentateuch, a stunning pattern emerges.
The sources map this out perfectly. In the book of Numbers, specifically chapters 3, 8, and 18, this exact pair of verbs, to abad and to shamar, is assigned almost exclusively to the Levites.
It becomes the technical terminology for priestly temple service.
Their sacred duty is to serve the tabernacle and to guard its sacred precincts from ritual impurity or unauthorized intrusion. So Moses, compiling these texts for an Israelite audience already familiar with the tabernacle cultus, is retroactively applying the precise job description of Levitical priest to Adam.
The syntax foregrounds the worshipful priestly service over the agricultural labor. Adam was commissioned to minister in God's creational sanctuary.
And that priestly commission carried an expansive mandate. Adam wasn't just supposed to maintain a static garden. The command to fill the earth and subdue it implies that he was to take the order, the beauty, and the localized presence of God found within the borders of Eden and push those boundaries outward,
expanding the sacred space until the entire globe was transformed into a macro temple.
There is another linguistic nuance the sources highlight regarding the nature of God's presence in that space. Genesis 3.8 describes the sound of the Lord God walking in the garden. The Hebrew text utilizes the word methalic, which is the hithpale stem of the verb halak.
The hithpale stem is highly significant here. It denotes a reflexive or intensive action, literally walking back and forth or walking about. It's not just describing a casual evening stroll.
Right. It's not a relaxed walk in the park.
Far from it. In the context of ancient Near Eastern deity concepts, it signifies an intimate, localized, and covenantal divine presence. It is a liturgical walking. And this exact grammatical form is resurrected later in Leviticus 26 and Deuteronomy 23 to explicitly describe God's presence walking back and forth in the midst of the Israelite camp.
Among the tabernacle tents.
Exactly.
The presence in Eden is the exact same localized presence established in the later sanctuaries.
Wow.
If you are listening and absorbing this material, it completely rewrites the paradigm of what devout living actually is.
It really does.
So often, modern devotion is framed as an attempt to escape the physical mundane world to achieve some ethereal, disembodied spiritual state. But if the original creational design was a physical temple, and the original human vocation was priestly service within the material world, then true devotion is about reclaiming that creational intent.
Bringing the sacred into the mundane.
Whether you are analyzing financial data, teaching a classroom of students, or repairing a vehicle, that daily work, when executed with an awareness of God's presence, is the fulfillment of Abad and Shamar. You are serving and guarding the sphere of creation entrusted to you. You are operating as a priest in your localized environment.
That framing fundamentally elevates the dignity of human labor. It also brings the catastrophic nature of the fall in Genesis 3 into devastatingly sharp relief.
Because it wasn't just breaking a rule.
No, the fall is frequently reduced to a simple moral transgression, breaking an arbitrary rule about a piece of fruit. But through the lens of temple theology, the fall is the desecration of the axis mundi. The very image bearers commissioned to guard the sacred space and expand its borders instead introduced contamination into the sanctuary. They failed to shamar.
They failed to guard the space from the intrusion of the serpent. And the consequence of desecrating the sanctuary is always expulsion. They are driven out past the cherubim, losing access to the unmediated presence of God.
The discourse analysis of the text points out the severe thematic rupture here. The high cohesion of divine-human harmony established in Genesis 2 is shattered.
And this theological reality explains the deep existential alienation that characterizes the human condition. Humanity was engineered at the creational level for unmediated presence with the divine within a sacred space. Our separation from that source generates a profound, universal homesickness.
Which is something we all feel.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And the entirety of the subsequent biblical narrative is essentially God's complex, unfolding operation to reverse that expulsion and reestablish dwelling with humanity.
Which transitions us perfectly to the next major epoch in this redemptive trajectory. After the expulsion, after the flood, after the patriarchal narratives of Genesis, God initiates a massive rescue operation. He pulls the descendants of Abraham out of Egyptian slavery, leading them into the desolate wilderness of Sinai.
And it is there, in a completely barren landscape, that God reestablishes the localized intersection of heaven and earth. We enter the era of the tabernacle.
The sheer volume of textual real estate dedicated to the tabernacle in the book of Exodus is staggering. Chapters 25 through 40 are almost entirely consumed by meticulous blueprints, material lists, and construction accounts for a portable tent.
To a modern reader, scanning chapter after chapter, detailing bronze clasps, goat hair curtains, and the exact dimensions of acacia wood poles can feel incredibly tedious.
It reads like an ancient IKEA manual.
Exactly. But the sources emphasize that in ancient literature, such exhaustive detail signals immense theological gravity.
It absolutely does. The entire purpose of the Exodus event, the plagues, the Passover, the parting of the sea, the terrifying theophany at Mount Sinai, it all finds its ultimate summation in Exodus 25:8. God declares, "Let them make me a sanctuary, that I may dwell among them."
That I may dwell among them.
Yes. The Hebrew word translated as tabernacle is mishkan, derived from the root verb shekan, which means to dwell, to abide, or to settle down. This root is the foundation for the later rabbinic concept of the Shekinah, the manifest, localized glory of God.
God is dealing with a nomadic, traumatized, wilderness-wandering people, and he deliberately calibrates his sacred space to match their socio-historical condition. He doesn't demand a megalithic stone pyramid like the ones they just left in Egypt. He becomes a nomadic god.
Pitching his mishkan right in the center of their encampment, it is a micro-Eden on the move.
The sources make a crucial point about the origins of this design, too. The tabernacle is not the product of human architectural ingenuity. In Exodus 25:9, God explicitly commands Moses to construct the sanctuary and its furnishings exactly according to the tabnet.
The tabnet, the pattern or the heavenly blueprint.
Yes. When the Hebrew text was later translated into Greek in the Septuagint, the scholars used the word paradigma. This terminology suggests that the earthly tabernacle is a localized, physical, and necessarily limited replica of an invisible cosmic reality.
The heavenly throne room itself. God is providing a scale model of heaven that can exist on earth. Furthermore, the literary discourse analysis reveals a profound structural elegance in how these instructions are delivered. The building blueprints in Exodus 25 through 31 are structured around 7 distinct divine speeches.
Each introduced by the phrase, "The Lord said to Moses."
Exactly, 7 divine speeches.
That is a direct, deliberate, literary callback to the 7 days of creation in Genesis 1.
Precisely. The text is phrasing the construction of the tabernacle as a new creation event. Just as God brought order to the primordial chaos in Genesis, he is now establishing an enclave of divine order amidst the chaos of the wilderness.
The Spirit of God, which hovered over the waters in Genesis 1, is now said to specifically fill Bezalel, the chief artisan of the tabernacle.
Giving him wisdom to build the sacred space, it is the restoration of the Edenic reality in a portable format.
But right at the climax of this beautiful new creation sequence, the narrative suffers a catastrophic interruption. And the sources spend considerable time analyzing the structural placement of the golden calf incident.
It is one of the most jarring narrative transitions in the text. The immaculate divine blueprints are delivered in chapters 25 through 31. Then suddenly, in chapters 32 through 34, while Moses is still on the mountain receiving the instructions for authorized worship, the Israelites at the base of the mountain are pooling their plundered Egyptian gold to construct an unauthorized idolatrous substitute.
They build the golden calf.
It is the ultimate anti-creation event. Before the sacred space can even be erected, the people desecrate the covenant.
It is a macro-level repetition of the Edenic fall. Humanity, completely unwilling to wait for God's mediated presence on God's terms, attempts to manipulate and manufacture the divine presence on their own terms.
The fallout is devastating, involving plague and mass execution. The covenant is fundamentally shattered. But the structural insight our sources draw from the subsequent chapters is profound. Following Moses' intercession and the renewal of the covenant, the text resumes in chapters 35 through 40 with the actual physical construction of the Mishkan.
Repeating the earlier instructions almost verbatim.
Verbatim.
The repetition of those blueprints isn't poor editing. It's a massive theological argument. The fact that the narrative proceeds with the construction of the tabernacle after the staggering betrayal of the golden calf reveals the absolute tenacity of God's pursuit.
Divine presence is not permanently forfeited by human failure, provided that a system of atonement is in place.
The tabernacle that is ultimately erected in Exodus 40 is not a shrine for perfect people. It is explicitly the tabernacle of a deeply flawed, forgiven people.
That is the theological genius of the Levitical system that operates within that tent. It provided a mechanism, through the sacrificial blood, to cleanse the sanctuary of the impurities generated by the people, allowing the holy God to remain in the midst of an unholy camp without consuming them.
When you process that reality, it profoundly deepens your affection for the nature of God. We all have our own variations of the golden calf. We construct unauthorized systems of control. We manufacture our own security. We seek transcendence and comfort outside of the parameters God has established. We fail spectacularly in our own wilderness experiences.
And yet, the theology of the tabernacle insists that God's primary disposition is not abandonment.
It is pursuit. His desire to dwell among them overrides the rebellion, provided we engage with the atonement he provides, which, as we know, ultimately points to the final atonement of Christ. True devout living means trusting that God wants to pitch his tent in the messy, unresolved areas of your life, offering proximity even when you feel profoundly unqualified for it.
The portability of the tabernacle was necessary for the wilderness, but as the socio-political reality of Israel shifted from a loose confederation of nomadic tribes to a centralized, settled monarchy in the Promised Land, the architectural expression of God's presence evolved. This brings us to the First Temple era.
Dominated by the construction of Solomon's temple in the mid-10th century BC.
Right. The historical narrative in 1 Kings chapters 6 through 8 and 2 Chronicles chapters 3 through 7 describes a massive escalation in scale and opulence. The construction of this temple is presented as the culmination of the Davidic covenant, centralizing the national cultus in Jerusalem on Mount Moriah.
Our sources note that Solomon's temple effectively doubled the physical dimensions of the wilderness tabernacle.
It transitioned from a precarious tent of skins and fabric to a permanent monolithic structure of massive quarried stone and imported Lebanese cedar. It rigidly maintained the tripartite gradation of holiness we saw in Eden and the tabernacle. You had the outer porch known as the ulam,
The main central hall, the Hakel,
and the innermost sanctuary, the Holy of Holies, which the Hebrew text calls the debir.
The geometry of the debir is something the sources highlight heavily. It was a perfect cube, 20 cubits in length, 20 cubits in width, and 20 cubits in height. The perfection of its dimensions reflected the absolute perfection of the presence it housed.
And the interior was an absolute sensory overload of wealth. The walls, floors, and ceiling were entirely overlaid with pure gold. The wood paneling was intricately carved with gourds, open flowers, and palm trees.
Again, explicitly recreating the botanical environment of Eden.
Yes. At the entrance to the ulam stood two massive, freestanding bronze pillars, named Jachin and Boaz,
which the sources translate roughly as he establishes and in him is strength. The architecture itself was a theological confession, and inside the debir, Solomon placed two colossal cherubim carved from olive wood, each standing 10 cubits high with wingspans of 10 cubits.
Their wings stretched entirely across the most holy place, touching wall to wall, forming a massive golden canopy directly over the ancient Ark of the Covenant. It was designed to look like the ultimate permanent realization of the guarded Edenic sanctuary, an impenetrable fortress of holiness.
However, the discourse analysis of the king's narratives points out a highly significant syntactic interruption. Right in the middle of this triumphant recounting of architectural dominance, there is what scholars call an offline divine speech.
In 1 Kings 6:11-13, as the text is laboring over the details of the stonework and the cedar, God suddenly interrupts the blueprint with a severe conditional warning. The text says, "Now the word of the Lord came to Solomon, concerning this house that you are building. If you will walk in my statutes and obey my rules and keep all my commandments and walk in them, then I will establish my word with you."
Then I will establish my word with you.
Right, "and I will dwell among the children of Israel and will not forsake my people Israel."
If you will walk in my statutes. The prominence of that conditional statement subordinates all the gold, all the cedar, and all the perfect cubic dimensions to a single reality: covenant fidelity. God is explicitly stating that his localized presence cannot be coerced, manipulated, or permanently captured by human architecture.
The building itself possesses no inherent magic to force God to stay.
And the tragedy of the Solomonic Temple is that its very permanence became a stumbling block. The nation began to trust in the invulnerability of the building rather than the character of the God it represented. They assumed the axis mundi was a permanent fixture that would protect them, regardless of their rampant idolatry and social injustice.
And we see the devastating result of that assumption in the prophetic literature. The prophet Ezekiel, writing during the early days of the Babylonian exile, provides the agonizing counter-narrative to 1 Kings 8. In 1 Kings 8, the glory cloud, the kavod, dramatically fills the newly built temple.
But in Ezekiel chapters 10 and 11, the prophet receives a horrifying vision of that exact same kavod, slowly, reluctantly, lifting from the cherubim, moving to the threshold, and ultimately departing from the profane temple entirely.
The divine presence abandons the axis mundi, leaving the massive stone complex as nothing more than an empty, vulnerable shell. Shortly after, in 586 BC, the Babylonian army under Nebuchadnezzar completely obliterates it, burning the cedar and carrying off the gold.
The permanent house was lost and the people were exiled. The psychological and theological trauma of that event cannot be overstated. But the narrative of God's pursuit doesn't end in the rubble of Babylon. After 70 years, the geopolitical landscape shifts. The Persian Empire overthrows Babylon, and King Cyrus issues an edict allowing the Jewish exiles to return to Jerusalem and rebuild.
Initiating the Second Temple era, chronicled in Ezra, Nehemiah, and the prophets Haggai and Zechariah. The rebuilding effort, led by Zerubbabel, which was eventually completed around 516 BC, was fraught with intense socioeconomic difficulties and deep theological ambiguity.
If you analyze the text of Ezra chapters 1 through 6, there is a stark austerity to the narrative. There are no detailed heavenly blueprints. There are no lists of exorbitant gold overlays. There is just the grueling, contested labor of laying a foundation and erecting a modest house, the bait.
And the emotional climax of that rebuilding effort happens in Ezra chapter 3, and it is a profoundly complex moment. The foundation of this new temple has finally been laid. The priests are dressed in their vestments, blowing trumpets, and the people are singing psalms of praise.
But the text explicitly notes that many of the older priests and heads of families, the elders who had survived the exile and remember the overwhelming glory of Solomon's original temple, wept with a loud voice when they saw this new foundation.
Meanwhile, the younger generation, who had only known the exile, shouted aloud for joy. The text says the sound of the joyful shout and the sound of the bitter weeping were entirely indistinguishable.
The weeping of the elders highlights a profound theological crisis. The physical diminishment of the new temple was obvious, but the spiritual absence was far more devastating. This second temple lacked the Ark of the Covenant, which had been permanently lost during the Babylonian destruction. The Holy of Holies was completely empty.
Furthermore, there is no biblical record of the visible Shekinah glory cloud descending to fill this new structure the way it had for Moses and Solomon. It was a partial, ambiguous restoration. The burning question was, had the presence of God truly returned to dwell with them?
To navigate that crisis, the post-exilic prophets had to radically reframe the community's expectations. The prophet Haggai directly addresses the crushing disappointment of the elders. He asked them, "Who is left among you who saw this house in its former glory? How do you see it now? Is it not? There's nothing in your eyes."
But then he delivers a prophecy that shifts the entire trajectory of the temple motif. In Haggai 2.9, God declares, "The latter glory of this house shall be greater than the former, says the Lord of hosts."
That prophecy forced the post-exilic community to look past the modest brick and mortar of Zerubbabel's temple toward an eschatological horizon. The physical building was no longer the ultimate fulfillment. It was merely a signpost pointing toward a future, decisive, cosmic intervention by God that would unleash a glory far surpassing anything Solomon had engineered.
Yet, as history progressed, human ambition inevitably tried to force that greater glory into existence through sheer financial and architectural brute force. I am talking about the massive, unprecedented expansion of the Second Temple complex initiated by King Herod the Great around 20 BC.
Our sources rely heavily on the detailed first-hand accounts of the first-century Jewish historian Josephus, specifically his works The Jewish War and Antiquities of the Jews. Josephus's descriptions of the Herodian temple depict a structure of almost unimaginable scale and opulence.
Josephus writes that the exterior of the sanctuary was covered with plates of gold of such immense weight that when the sun rose, it radiated a fiery splendor that forced onlookers to avert their eyes.
Where the exterior wasn't gold, it was constructed of massive blocks of pure white stone. From a distance, Josephus noted it looked like a snow-clad mountain.
The engineering was staggering. The Temple Mount was expanded into a massive platform supported by foundation stones weighing hundreds of tons. It featured monumental gates, vast courtyards divided by strict purity boundaries, and massive porticos like the Royal Stoa, which was supported by 162 colossal columns.
Josephus utilizes distinct Greek terminology here, distinguishing between the hieron, which encompassed the massive, sprawling sacred precincts and courtyards, and the naos.
The naos, which referred strictly to the inner sanctuary building itself. It was designed to rival the greatest temples of the Greco-Roman world.
But the discourse analysis of Josephus's text reveals a dark, tragic irony woven through the opulence. While he is describing the blinding gold and the white marble, Josephus also heavily emphasizes the massive defensive fortifications of the complex.
Yes, the temple had effectively become a fortress. It was heavily militarized, overlooked by the towering Antonia fortress where the Roman garrison was stationed. The sacred space was routinely the site of violent political insurrections, assassinations, and factional warfare. And the ultimate irony is that Josephus is writing these glowing architectural descriptions after the year AD 70.
He is writing about the most glorious building in the world, knowing full well that it has already been completely leveled by the Roman legions under Titus. It's a pile of charred rubble.
The external grandeur completely masked a deep, systemic internal corruption. The prophetic warnings of Jesus in the Gospels perfectly encapsulate this. Jesus walked into those massive, affluent Herodian courtyards and violently disrupted the economic exploitation happening there, declaring, "You have made my Father's house a den of robbers."
He wept over the city, prophesying that not one stone of that magnificent complex would be left upon another.
The destruction of Herod's temple was interpreted as a definitive divine judgment on a religious system that had prioritized a militarized architectural facade over actual covenantal fidelity. The contrast between the modest, empty temple of Zerubbabel and the opulent, heavily fortified temple of Herod provides a massive point of reflection for us today.
It really does, because how frequently do we construct Herodian spiritual lives? We invest massive amounts of energy into ensuring the exterior looks flawless. We want the white marble and the blinding gold of public success, theological certainty, and moral respectability. We fortify our boundaries, militarize our defenses against criticism, and project an image of impregnable strength.
But internally, the space might be entirely devoid of the actual presence of God. It's a hollow fortress.
Devout living has absolutely nothing to do with projecting an impressive religious facade. It is rooted in humble, covenantal obedience. Even if your current reality feels more like the meager, weeping foundation of Ezra's day, even if it feels small, unimpressive, and fragile, if the genuine pursuit of God's presence is there, that is where the true glory resides.
That tension between the corrupt earthly reality and the desire for true holiness drove the profound theological developments we see in the prophetic and intertestamental literature. Because the earthly temples were continually compromised, whether destroyed by Babylon or corrupted by Herodian politics, the spiritual imagination of the Jewish people looked upward. They began receiving and recording complex visions of ideal heavenly sanctuaries that could never be defiled by human hands.
This brings us to the ideal visions part of our analysis, and we have to start with the prophet Ezekiel. While sitting in exile in Babylon, grappling with the trauma of the first temple's destruction, Ezekiel receives a massive, mind-bending vision of a new temple complex spanning chapters 40 through 48.
It is the longest, most sustained architectural description in the entire Hebrew Bible. For 9 chapters, Ezekiel is given a meticulous, highly structured, guided tour of a massive temple complex by an angelic being wielding a measuring reed.
The entire vision is obsessed with exact geometric measurements, symmetry, and escalating gradients of holiness.
The Hebrew concept of kodesh, or holiness, dominates the text. The architecture itself, the multiple gated courtyards, the severe restricted access, the massive central altar, is designed to enforce absolute, unyielding purity. It is a vision of divine order permanently replacing human chaos.
But scholars point out that the most profound theological statements in Ezekiel's vision aren't found in what is measured. They are found in what is completely missing. Our sources highlight the significant absences in this ideal temple.
In all those chapters of excruciatingly detailed measurements, several of the most iconic elements of the Israelite cultus are entirely omitted. There is no mention of the golden menorah, there is no mention of the table of showbread, there is no incense altar, there is no massive veil separating the holy place from the Holy of Holies, and most shockingly, there is absolutely no mention of the Ark of the Covenant.
To an ancient Israelite, a temple without the Ark of the Covenant is like a body without a heart. How can Ezekiel's ultimate ideal temple be missing the very throne of God?
The answer lies in the dramatic climax of the vision in Ezekiel 43. The glory of God, the kavod, which Ezekiel previously saw departing the city in judgment, is seen returning from the east. It violently fills the entire house.
So the reason the ark, the veil, and the mediating furniture are obsolete in this vision is because the presence of God is portrayed as becoming so permanent, so direct, and so overwhelming that it completely bypasses the need for the old, localized mediating tools.
The shadow is finally giving way to the ultimate substance.
The mediator is no longer required because the presence is universally accessible within the space. And the result of that unmediated presence is cosmic renewal. Ezekiel 47 describes a tiny trickle of water flowing from the threshold of this visionary temple. That trickle rapidly expands into an uncrossable river that flows east, down into the desolate Araba Valley, and empties into the hypersaline waters of the Dead Sea.
And wherever the river flows, it turns the salt water fresh. It brings teeming life to an absolute wasteland. Trees grow along its banks, bearing fresh fruit every month, and the text specifically notes that their leaves are for healing.
It is the full, magnificent blossoming of the Edenic motif. The sacred space is no longer conceived as a static defensive building designed to keep the profane out. It has become a dynamic, localized source of cosmic renewal that actively radiates outward to heal the surrounding world.
But Ezekiel wasn't the only ancient voice envisioning an ideal alternative to the earthly realities. Our sources take a deep, fascinating dive into the extra-biblical literature of the Second Temple period. We're looking at texts from the Dead Sea Scrolls and apocalyptic works like 1 Enoch and the Testament of Levi. These texts provide a crucial window into the socio-religious psychology of the era.
The historical context here is vital. During the Hellenistic and Roman periods, various sectarian groups looked at the priesthood operating the temple in Jerusalem and saw nothing but political compromise, illegitimate lineage, and deep moral corruption.
In response, they generated literature that aggressively critiqued the earthly institution by juxtaposing it with visions of flawless, heavenly realities.
In the Book of the Watchers, which constitutes the first section of 1 Enoch, the patriarch Enoch is taken on a terrifying heavenly ascent. The architecture he describes in chapter 14 is radically different from the stone of Jerusalem. He encounters a multi-chambered heavenly structure. First, he enters a massive house built entirely of hailstones, surrounded by fire.
He then passes into a second, even greater house composed of pure flame, containing a high throne made of crystal and ice.
Fire, hail, crystal, and ice. The discourse analysis of 1 Enoch shows a profound rhetorical focus on extreme, terrifying inaccessibility. By merging these inherently incompatible and lethal elements, the author is emphasizing the absolute, terrifying holiness and otherness of God's true dwelling place.
It is a space completely insulated from the political machinations and ritual impurities of the earthly priesthood. Similarly, the Testament of Levi maps out a layered, multi-tiered heaven, arguing that the highest heaven serves as the ultimate, true Holy of Holies, operated entirely by an angelic priesthood that cannot be corrupted.
They are essentially arguing that the true axis mundi is not the compromised stone building in Jerusalem, but the unassailable throne room in the heavens. But then you have the community at Qumran, the sect responsible for the Dead Sea Scrolls, who took a different approach. They completely withdrew from Jerusalem and went out into the desert. Among their writings is the massive Temple Scroll.
The Temple Scroll is essentially a utopian architectural blueprint. The Qumran community believed the current temple was defiled, so they envisioned a future, massive temple complex characterized by 3 enormous, perfectly concentric square courtyards. And the purity regulations detailed in the scroll are extreme, far more rigorous than anything found in Leviticus.
They sought to extend the intense holiness required for the inner sanctuary outward, encompassing the entire city of Jerusalem, demanding absolute, flawless perfection from anyone who entered.
When you synthesize Ezekiel's vision of the returning glory, Enoch's terrifying ascent into the fiery heavens, and the Temple Scroll's desperate, agonizing demand for absolute purity, you begin to understand the intense spiritual hunger of the first century.
These ancient writers were absolutely desperate. They were starved for a pure, uncorrupted mediator. They were longing for a sacred space where the heavy weight of their sin could actually be dealt with and where they could finally experience proximity to God without the threat of lethal judgment. They knew the earthly system was fundamentally broken.
And when you sit with that historical desperation, it completely reframes your appreciation for what happens next in the narrative. Because we feel that same exact desperation today. We look at the brokenness of our own systems, our own constant moral failures, our own inability to manufacture the purity that God requires.
That universal desperation is the exact dark backdrop against which the incarnation shines the brightest.
Which brings us to the ultimate, shocking fulfillment of the entire temple motif. The turning point of this massive theological trajectory does not arrive in the form of a revised architectural blueprint from heaven. It arrives in a human body. It arrives in the person of Jesus of Nazareth.
The Gospel of John makes this profound Christological connection explicit in the very first chapter. John 1.12 contains one of the most loaded theological statements in the entire New Testament. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory, glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth.
Dwelt among us. The English translation doesn't quite capture the sheer architectural weight of the Greek text here. The sources dive deep into the lexical choices John is making.
The Greek verb John utilizes is iskenosin. It is derived directly from the noun skene, which translates literally to tent or tabernacle.
It is the exact terminology the Greek Septuagint uses to translate the Hebrew references to the wilderness tabernacle. John is making a shocking, literal claim. The divine eternal Word became human flesh and actively tabernacled among us.
God pitched his tent, his mishkan, in a localized human body.
Precisely. And John continues by stating, "We have seen his glory." The Greek word for glory is doxa, which is the direct translation of the Hebrew kavod. The exact same overwhelming lethal presence that filled the wilderness tabernacle in Exodus 40, the presence that filled Solomon's temple in 1 Kings 8, and the presence Ezekiel saw returning to the ideal temple, is now entirely localized and dwelling bodily in the person of the Son.
Jesus isn't just a prophet pointing to the temple. He claims to be the reality the temple was always pointing toward. In John chapter 2, we see this climax. Jesus enters the massive, corrupt Herodian temple precincts, clears out the exploitative money changers, and when the religious authorities demand a sign to justify his authority over the space, he says, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up."
The authorities are baffled, noting it took 46 years to build Herod's complex. But John provides the crucial interpretive key for the reader. But he was speaking about the temple of his body. And the specific vocabulary John uses here is vital. He does not use the Greek word hieron, which refers to the broader temple precincts, the porticos, and the courtyards.
He uses the word naos.
Exactly. Naos refers strictly and exclusively to the inner shrine, the Holy of Holies, the absolute epicenter of the divine presence. Jesus is publicly declaring that he, in his physical incarnate body, has entirely superseded the stone building. He is the ultimate naos. He is the true final axis mundi.
The localized space where the holiness of heaven and the messiness of earth finally perfectly intersect without destroying each other. He provides the final atonement, he opens the access, and he reveals the glory. Every single mediating function of the Levitical system is completely absorbed into his person.
The theological implications of that claim are staggering. It means that when Jesus is crucified, when the true naos is violently torn down on the cross, the barrier is finally broken. The Synoptic Gospels record that at the exact moment of his death, the massive, thick veil inside the Herodian temple, the veil embroidered with the guarding cherubim, was supernaturally torn in two from top to bottom.
The tearing of the veil is the definitive architectural declaration that the localized restriction of God's presence has ended. Because the ultimate sacrifice has been offered by the ultimate high priest in the ultimate temple, the way into the Holy of Holies is now completely, permanently thrown open to humanity. The shadow has entirely given way to the substance.
Which sets the stage perfectly for the grand cosmic finale of the entire biblical canon. We arrive at the book of Revelation, chapters 21 and 22.
We began this deep dive by imagining the most spectacular temple building on earth and then tearing it down. This is the moment in the text where that paradox is fully realized. John, the author of Revelation, sees a vision of a new heaven and a new earth, and he watches the holy city, the New Jerusalem, descending out of heaven from God. But what he notes about the interior of the city is arguably the most mind-blowing architectural statement in all of Scripture.
In Revelation 21.22, John is surveying the massive, gleaming city, and he writes, "And I saw no temple in the city."
I saw no temple. The sources refer to this as the magnificent negative.
It is a stunning reversal. And again, John uses the specific word naos, I saw no inner shrine. The discourse analysis of this specific verse highlights a profound grammatical structure. The negation I saw no temple is immediately followed by an explanatory clause governed by the Greek conjunction gar, which means for or because.
He explicitly tells us why the building is missing.
He writes, "For its temple is the Lord God, the Almighty, and the Lamb." The reason there is no localized stone building is because God and the Lamb are the temple. The negation in the text is not a statement of loss or absence. It is a statement of overwhelming, unimaginable surplus.
The reality of God's unmediated presence has so completely saturated and overwhelmed the entirely renewed creation that the localized sign, the building that pointed to the presence, has been rendered completely obsolete. The separation between the sacred and the ordinary is forever abolished.
The text of Revelation 21 and 22 is structured around a chain of these magnificent negatives. The sources map out how every single barrier and consequence introduced by the fallen Eden is systematically reversed and deleted. There is no temple. There is no need for the sun or the moon because the glory of God provides the illumination. The gates of the city are never shut, signifying perfect security. There is no night. There is no more sea, which to the ancient mind represented chaos and the abyss. And crucially, Revelation 22.3 declares, "No longer will there be anything accursed."
The curse of Genesis 3 is entirely lifted, and notice what is completely absent from John's description of the gates of the New Jerusalem. There is absolutely no mention of the cherubim.
The sentinels with the flaming sword are gone.
The guard has been permanently stood down. They are no longer required to protect the holiness of God from the impurity of humanity because the blood of the Lamb has made the inhabitants of the city perfectly, permanently holy. The threat of profanation has been eradicated.
That is an incredibly beautiful detail. The cherubim finally get to retire, and in the center of the city, John sees the river of the water of life flowing directly from the throne, and the tree of life bearing 12 kinds of fruit, its leaves providing healing for the nations. It is the explicit, triumphant recapitulation of the Garden of Eden, but massively escalated. It is Eden perfected, universalized, and made entirely indestructible.
And we cannot conclude without addressing the profound architectural Easter egg hidden in the dimensions of the New Jerusalem. In Revelation 21.1 scene, an angel measures the descending city. The text states that its length, width, and height are exactly equal 12,000 stadia. It is an unimaginably massive, perfect cube.
And as we established earlier, where is the only other place in the biblical architectural record where we encounter a perfect cube?
The Debir. The Holy of Holies in Solomon's temple was a perfect cube of 20 cubits.
By assigning the New Jerusalem these specific cubic dimensions, John is making a massive, inescapable theological declaration. The city isn't merely like a sanctuary. The entire massive city, and by extension the entirety of the renewed cosmos, has literally become the Holy of Holies.
The severely restricted, heavily mediated access of the ancient Israelite high priest, who could only slip behind the veil once a year with fear and trembling, is replaced by the permanent, universal, unobstructed access of all God's redeemed people.
Revelation 22.4 sums up the ultimate goal of the universe in 5 words. They will see his face.
Unmediated face-to-face communion. The Axis Mundi has expanded to encompass all of reality. If you are tracking with this massive theological progression, I want to bring this all the way back to the core focus of our deep dive. How does this intricate theology of God's presence fundamentally deepen your love for Jesus and reshape your devotion today? When you look at the complex, bloody, and restricted systems of the Old Testament, the thick veils, the complex purity laws, the desperate cries of the Qumran community for an unattainable perfection, you realize the immense weight of what Jesus actually accomplished.
He is the Lamb who absorbed the judgment. He is the one whose broken body tore the veil. He is the one who stood down the cherubim and extinguished the flaming sword.
He is the one who made this barrier-free intimacy with the Creator of the universe possible for you. Devout living, therefore, is not a frantic, anxiety-ridden attempt to perfectly follow a set of religious rules so that an angry deity will tolerate you. Devout living is living today in the profound, settled light of that guaranteed future. It is walking through your daily life knowing that the final chapter of your story is perfect, unhindered, joyful communion. You are invited into the cube. The access is open.
It is a staggering trajectory of grace. We have moved from a provisional, highly localized presence in a guarded garden, to a portable tent among nomads, to a fragile stone building, to the bodily incarnation of the Son, and finally to a cosmic reality where the presence of God is as ubiquitous as the air we breathe.
It is the greatest story ever told. So as we wrap up this extensive deep dive, we want to leave you with a final provocative thought to process as you step back into the reality of your week. Our sources noted that back in the primordial Garden of Eden, humanity's original mandate in Genesis 1:28 was to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. The implicit vocation was that the image bearers were supposed to take the borders of that localized sacred space and actively expand them until the glory of God covered the entire globe.
The priestly vocation was always meant to be expansive. The sanctuary was designed to grow.
Exactly. So here's the philosophical reframing for you. If the absolute end of the cosmic story, the New Jerusalem, is a world completely, totally saturated with God's unmediated presence, how does that reality alter the way you view the mundane, ordinary spaces you inhabit right now? The New Testament explicitly designates those who are in Christ as a royal priesthood. That is your current identity.
Is it possible that the way you engage with your family at the dinner table tonight, the patience and grace you exhibit in a highly stressful, crowded grocery store, the absolute integrity you maintain in a tedious corporate meeting?
Is it possible that in those seemingly secular, ordinary moments, you are actually participating in the ancient Edenic mandate?
Yeah.
Are you actively expanding the borders of God's sacred space today? Are you bringing the atmosphere, the grace, and the order of the New Jerusalem into the chaos of your localized environment?
That is the ultimate definition of a devout life. Operating as a priest in the present moment, entirely fueled and shaped by the guaranteed reality of the future.
Thank you for joining us on this incredibly dense, profound deep dive into the theology of God's presence. We hope this exploration of the ancient texts has challenged your mind, expanded your theological framework, and most importantly, deepened your absolute awe and affection for Jesus. Step confidently into your priestly vocation today, and we will catch you on the next deep dive.